I've transferred over to Nova UCD. I'm delighted to be there. Great team. Just started last week and off and running. But before that, what I was doing last year was working with Progress TT, which is a pan-European project to look at how to enhance the performance of tech transfer offices all across Europe. And there's some really great practice out there. One of the things that, and I was involved in that as a mentor and an expert in the space, and mentoring different tech transfer offices, one of the things that you find is that while we all sound like we're doing the same kind of things, we're all looking at invention disclosures, we're all looking for somebody to license it to, and we're doing startups, the devil is in the detail. The differences in approach that we have makes huge differences in terms of the impact that we have, makes huge differences in the numbers that we can create and in the economic impact that we have. So I'm delighted to have here 3 experts that have done all that, have the expertise. It's very important to listen to them and listen to the subtleties between what they're doing and what you might be doing. The way I liken it is a menu. You know, the things can look the same in a menu in McDonald's as they do in a high-end restaurant, but the experience is quite different and the impact is quite different. So it's really important. With that, I'd ask each of them to do a quick introduction for themselves in terms of what they're currently doing. So start with you, Paul.
Yeah, I did not change job recently. I'm still working at the University of Leuven, which is a mid-sized university about 20 kilometers from Brussels, Belgium. Classical tech transfer office, patenting, licensing, collaborative research, and spin-out activities.
Hi, Dave Winwood, and I'm at Pennington Biomedical Research Center, which is an all-research campus of Louisiana State University. Very small technology transfer in the classical sense, more interested in corporate partnerships. Also, as you'll see in the little write-up there, I'm Assistant Executive Director of LSU's Innovation Park, which has many more corporate contacts and incubator setups.
And James Zanowich from Tulane University School of Medicine in New Orleans, Louisiana. It's a mid-sized private institution, just about an hour and a half down the road from Dave. And I do not do tech transfer anymore. I did that for years, but now I focus on corporate partnerships, corporate engagement, and basically any kind of interaction or knowledge transfer that could happen across the spectrum.
So just as Brendan said earlier, this is really about your opportunity to ask lots of questions. So as you begin to think up a question, raise your hand, they'll get a mic to you, and I'll look out then for them to signal me to stop any point and ask your question, because your questions are no doubt very important and maybe even better than my questions. So, but I'll start with my questions. So first of all, Paul, you're doing the tech transfer from Leuven. Leuven, as we all know, has just been recognized by writers as the #1 most innovative university in Europe. How did you achieve that?
Well,
maybe start with what it is.
Yeah, since a couple of years, Reuters, the data and press agency, they make up a ranking of those universities that succeed the best in getting their technology into the market. Yeah, because what is innovation? Innovation is not doing inventions, but making inventions, doing breakthroughs, and apply them in the market. So they use a whole bunch of hopefully scientific parameters, like not only number of patents and patent applications, granted patents, but also how many, for example, joint publications do you have together with industry, and how many times is your university referred to, or your research institute referred to, in publications or patents that are made by industry. So a whole bunch of indicators where they try to estimate who gets their technology out there, let's put it that way. Okay. And they do that since, I think, 2 or 3 years.
And so to be the #1, are you doing something different? And have you had to change how you do things to stay #1?
Well, let me start by saying that I think a lot of things that help are not under our, and then I mean the tech transfer offices, our control. To quote a couple of them, our office exists already since 1972. Means that not only did we had a lot of time to make all the mistakes that there are to make, but also in order to achieve a good culture in your university, time is a very, very important concept. Yeah. And by now, we have in some departments already the third generation of PIs that are used to work with the tech transfer office. So also there, it's a little bit unfair to compare us with universities that just started out 5 years ago or 10 years ago with tech transfer. The second thing that really has helped us is that, and is it luck or something else, I don't know, we've had over the last couple of decades a whole bunch of university management people, rectors, vice rectors, etc., who were extremely entrepreneurial. Some of our rectors have created companies that went to the NASDAQ and EASDAQ at the time. Others have been very active in licensing and working together. And you know, we should not be, as Tech Transfer Office, we should not be overconfident in stating that we can make researchers start working with industry. We can facilitate, but it is not because of the fact that we as a tech transfer say, you should, they are not going to do it. One of the things that help them doing it is if at the top of the university, somebody is leading by example. If a good researcher who becomes vice rector or rector or whatever, if he's doing the stuff, and not only printing glossy brochures, but if he is really bringing it into practice, that kind of trickles down, yeah, over time. Again, time is important. And last but not least, I think the system that we have is a little bit atypical probably, because we also create some kind of, you can almost call it virtual company per PI, per professor. As soon as a professor wants to do something with industry, we create some kind of a budget place for him, really almost comparable to a virtual company. All the income and all the expenses that he achieves in interacting with industry will end up on that account. Legally, they are from the university, but it is his decision what to do with it. And the point is that as a university, we are not different than all the other universities, meaning that if you want to order a pencil, you have to fill out a form in triplicate. And if you want to hire an additional lab technician, that takes you 2 years because you have to start lobbying with your colleagues because everybody wants another lab technician, then securing budget, etc., etc. The money on these accounts, on these virtual company accounts of the PIs, it's up to them what to do with it. So if they say, I have saved X amount of money and I want to hire an additional lab technician, they can hire that additional lab technician as of tomorrow. Yeah? So it gives them a very, very big, how should I put it, feeling of autonomy. And then bringing back or closing the loop to tech transfer, what we see is that a lot of our researchers use that money for what you could call proof of concept funding. Yeah? If there's an interesting project and the PI believes in it, he can say, well, I am going to pay my postdoc another 2 years in order to enable him to elaborate the, sorry, Jeff, business plan or, you know, do some proof of concept, etc., etc. Yeah. The professors can, so there's a really, really big, how should I put it, feeling of ownership amongst the professors. They really feel it's their project, their money. They do a lot of blue sky research with that money also, where probably they would find difficulties in getting funding otherwise, because it's a little bit out of the box or not following the ordinary paths. And quite of our invention disclosures come specifically out of these kind of crazy stuff, let's put it that way. You can, and then I close, you can really consider it as a virtual company because the professors can even pay themselves a bonus, a private bonus, out of the net profit. But the interesting thing is that out of the about 1,000 accounts we have in that way, about 1,000 PIs work on a regular basis with us, less than 5% actually uses the possibility to pay themselves a bonus. So you can see that the agenda of most of the PIs are really aligned. They live for their research. Yeah? It's a very small minority that's in there for the quick buck. Yeah? If they have the choice to finally buy the lab equipment or finally execute the research project that they have been dreaming about already for quite some years, or pay themselves a bonus, the vast majority goes for the first one. Yeah? Yes, yeah. Yeah. And that is some kind of an, I would almost say, automatic alignment of agenda.
That's very unique. You guys don't have anything like that, a researcher budget that the researcher has control over, it can be entrepreneurial around, nothing like that. I haven't seen that elsewhere. I think that's extraordinary, but I can see how it works. Can we just reset to overall research funding levels for your university? What size?
The research budget, you mean?
Research budget, yeah.
It's about, last year it was about 470 million, I think.
How many PIs, how many researchers would you engage with?
We have 1,500 PIs, of which 1,000 work on a regular basis with us. And by the way, that's one of the KPIs we keep track of, how many traction we have within our institution. Yeah. Of the 500 PIs that do not work regularly with us, there's a big chunk, theology, philosophy, etc., etc. So if you would sort out those professors that are in a domain that is, let's say, fit for tech transfer, the vast majority does work with us, yeah.
Okay, very good. And then in terms of just the raw numbers, number of inventions that you would see, number of patents you would see in a year?
Invention disclosures around 220 a year, roughly, sometimes a little bit more, sometimes a little bit less. We file quite quickly, so we file about 100 out of these 214, we file about 100 patent applications, but we pull the plug also relatively quickly. So we take the 30-month period that we have in the patent system, and we file quickly, we file ourselves also, but we pull the plug also relatively quickly if within the period of 30 months we don't really see something materialize.
Okay, and then the number of licenses and spin-outs that you would have?
Spin-out licenses about 60, last year I think 68 licenses. Spin-outs, we have two kinds of spin-outs. The spin-outs that we do not take equity in, we don't really keep track of them, so we don't have separate statistics. You have student spin-outs, you have other spin-outs that we just give a license and we don't take equity. The ones that we take equity in, last year we had, I think, five or six, yeah.
Very good. And in terms of your own team, how big is the team that supports that?
Yeah, we have a, also there we probably are a little bit atypical. Our team has 90 people, but it's, we specifically opted for the one-stop shop concept, meaning that we have the pure tech transfer activities as all of us do them, but on top of that, everything dealing with industry and intellectual property we do ourselves, meaning that we have our own finance department, we have our own HR department. For example, all the people that are to be hired in order to execute industrial contracts, or all people that are hired with these funds on these virtual accounts, they get a labor agreement of the tech transfer office. We have our own HR service. So out of the 5,000 researchers in total in our university, about 1,800 are on our payroll. Yeah. So out of these 90 people, about 45 people are in what you would describe as non-core tech transfer activities, finance department, HR department, a reception lady, etc., etc. And about 45 are in patenting, licensing, spinning out. The vast majority is active in all kinds of collaborative research, contract research, consulting activities with industry. That still is, after 45 years, our bread and butter. Not patenting, licensing, not spinning out. It's really the interactions with industry.
Yeah. Very good. And the number of licensing or case managers, licensing execs or case managers you'd have, how many is that?
Yeah, we don't have, we have a cradle-to-grave approach, meaning that in our IP department, those who take in the invention disclosure, they take it all the way up until licensing, negotiation, etc., etc. We have 8 people in our IP department and 2, what's the correct name?
Legal.
Not legal. They keep they keep an eye on the due dates. They keep an eye on compliance officers. Yeah. They do the trademark stuff and that kind of. So not real patent people, but they support the 8 other people. Yeah.
And is a lot of what you do push of technology? Do you push the technology out to companies when you go to take do you push it out, or are you more about collaboration and trying to draw companies in?
Collaboration still is our bread and butter, and even in the licenses that we conclude, we see that in about 60% of all the licenses that we conclude, it is a license that co-happens, is that the right word, with a collaborative research. Yeah? So, which is, by the way, also the reason why, one of the reasons why we pull the plug out of patent applications is if the PI is not really motivated. Even if we feel there could be something in it, our experience, which might be wrong and is very subjective, but our experience is that it is extremely difficult to bring a technology to the market if the PI doesn't care. Yeah?
Yes,
if
yeah.
he says, here it is, and you do your stuff, in a lot of cases, we pull the plug. So, yeah.
You also have proof of concept funds to help?
Yes. Well, we have two kind of proof of concept fund. To a large extent, again, this is the money under the supervision of the PIs themselves. Yeah? Okay. If you take a look at the number of incubation activities and proof of concepts that are financed by the PIs with their quote-unquote own money, that's a significant part. Lots of them fail, obviously. And then there's a real proof of concept fund that we have, which is established by the Flemish government, our government, I think about 7 years ago. It's a closed envelope to be distributed amongst the 5 Flemish universities according to tech transfer output parameters. So the one amongst the 5 who has the most patents, licenses, collaborations, spin-offs, etc. And I don't like all these parameters, but it is what it is. Over a sliding window of 5 years, that university gets the biggest chunk of the money. You are obliged to distribute the money within your university through a council that is composed, to a jury that is composed half of industry, half of academics, where we as an office have an advisory vote. So we are not a voting member, but we have an advisory vote. And that proof of concept fund, which then exists in all the 5 Flemish universities, but the amounts are different, of course, that is specifically for proof of concept. Yeah.
And does that take projects to launch of a company?
Can be. So whether it is to file patents or come to a point where a company could be interested in a collaboration, or where an investor could be interested to launch the company, everything that could facilitate bringing products or services to the market.
So did you agree with Jeff's commentary about asking the investor what the risks are?
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Are we seeing any questions yet? I mean, there's some pretty earth-shattering things that you should have heard there in terms of researchers having their own accounts and the proof of concepts, the way in which they're managed as well. Any questions? Are we seeing any questions? No? Still, we see a question over here. 2 questions over here.
Hi, thank you. Paula Aksher from Dog Care Products Limited, trading as Barking Bonkers Doggy Products International. I'm just wondering, is the onus then completely on the inventor to provide all the patents?
The sound is not very good.
Is the onus always on the inventor to provide all the patents?
What do you mean with provide the patents?
To financially do all the patents.
Do you have a patent budget and you make decisions, or do you rely on the inventors and the PIs to cover the patent costs?
It's a combination of both. So the first part of the patenting trajectory is taken care of by the office. So we file ourselves, so that's at relatively low cost. As soon as the out-of-pocket costs start to arrive, that has to come out of the budget of the own budget, as I mentioned it previously, of the PI. Yeah? We do have some kind of an emergency fund for those PIs that don't have their own money yet or anymore, or are in a segment where there is not a lot of money to make, for example. But everybody who has the possibility to finance his own costs, out-of-pocket patent costs, we ask them to do so. And for us, that's also a token of the buy-in. Yeah? If that researcher says, oh, this is a great invention, but I don't want to pay, that's the first alarm sign for us usually. Yeah? If we still feel, in despite of the reluctance of the PI to pay, if we still feel that it is absolutely to be protected in one way or another, we can pay, we have the budget to pay it for it ourselves, but then the part that will flow back to the PI's account will decrease dramatically.
Thank you very much. So if I could just ask, so patents, it is better to have patents on your products, of course, but can a product be licensed without patents?
It can be, yeah, sure. In most cases, companies will prefer patents, obviously, but we have had cases of licensing know-how. We have had cases of licensing, for example, insights in processing techniques where the company or we ourselves says it's better not to protect and keep it as a secret, because if you protect it, it's very difficult to detect if somebody breaches it at one side, and at the other side, sorry, and at the other side, the company will probably not be interested in a patent as such.
Thank you very much. It's very informative. Thank you.
So Paul, let me ask you about in terms of startups. So PI comes along to you and says, I've got this great idea, I want to do a startup, I've got some money to put into it myself from my fund. We just need a license from you. How do you come to an agreement around the equity split between the inventor, the monies that they're putting in, the ownership of the IP that you would have?
Yeah.
What's the arrangement?
There's no fixed arrangement. There are a couple of rules. The university will never take a majority. We feel that if we are engaged in spin-off companies, it's the market that has to play a role, not us as a university or the investors or whatever, but not us. So we will never take a majority, A. B, as to percentage, we try to play it as much as possible along the lines of what is the technology worth. Yeah? Meaning we do not have fixed percentages like we have to have minimum 10% or minimum X or Y. We have spin-offs in which we had, as of the start, 0.5%, and we had spin-offs where we had 45%. So there's a wide range. Do bear in mind that all the shares that we get as a university for contribution of technology or know-how, also these shares will end up in the virtual company accounts of the professors who generated the spin-off companies. Yeah?
Okay.
So if these shares are ever to be sold, it is the professor or professors, lots of professors have joint accounts, it's the professor or professors that will benefit from the proceeds of these accounts, which also makes that the discussions that we have with the PIs themselves on, how should I put it, determining the percentage are usually relatively smooth, because they are at both sides of the table.
Yes, which would be a kind of a conflict of interest situation that you have to manage, I presume.
Absolutely, and that's also the reason why we want to have buy-in from the researcher, but it's our office who decides on the percentage. So not the PI who will have the economic benefit of the shares.
Okay, and so Paul, if the university isn't taking anything back from this, if the equity sale, it's all going into the fund that the researcher ends up with, why does the university invest in, or is the university investing in your office and in tech transfer?
Well, first of all, it's not correct to say the university doesn't take anything back, because all these virtual accounts are the university. Yeah? If the professor uses these proceeds in his virtual account to, expand his lab, hire additional people, etc., that is the university. Okay. Only the control is not the vice rector or the dean or the head of department, it's the PI himself. Yeah? Right. That's one thing. Second, we do take something back on everything we do, whether it is licensing, whether it is consulting, whether it is shares of spin-outs. We take an overhead of 17%, 1/7. Half of it goes into the central account of the university, so that we give back to the university in general. The other half is our working budget. Yeah? So we do not get any, how should I put it, We do not get any subsidies or fixed budget from the university. No, we get, you could almost call it a commission on our turnover. If our turnover grows, we have more budget and I can hire people. If the day after tomorrow there's an economic crisis and our turnover would be slashed down, I will have to fire people probably. The thing I like personally is that with the budget that we get, it is fully up to the tech transfer office to decide what to do with it. Yeah? So as long as the results are there and the professors are happy, I do not have a board or you know, whatever entity that is really looking what we do with these investments. And that has meant in the past also that autonomy has meant in the past that also as a tech transfer office, we have been able to set up some interesting structures that probably would not have been possible if we would have to channel them through the ordinary decision-making systems of the university, because the library needs money and that department needs money, etc., etc. If as tech transfer office you are just one of the 500 entities that are crying for money in your university, probably you will not be at number one.
Very good.
I guess.
Okay. Thanks very much, Paul. David, if I can turn to you in terms of from the US, so as past president of Autumn, you've seen across the whole lot of the US and different operations and so on. What's your perspective in terms of why universities in the US, well, maybe start, actually, let me go back and start, because one of the discussions that we had earlier was that universities in the US are segmented somewhat differently than here. So maybe explain that for a start.
Yeah, first I just question your wisdom in inviting someone from South Yorkshire to talk about universities in the US, but you know, I have actually been there for a long, long time. So yeah, they're segmented, and one of the panelists this morning made a great comment that I had to scribble down about the effect, and this sounds like a downplay, but it's not at all. It's meant as a great compliment because it's something we have not accomplished yet in the US, and that is a sort of standardization through KTI, was what I read, that industry is now able to deal with a standardized set of expectations from the universities in the country. And one of the challenges that Tom referred to that we had discussed earlier was the fact that we don't have a national university system in the US, right? Our universities are at state level. And even within our small and poor state, there are 4 university systems, public university systems, and then a couple of private schools, including the largest, Tulane, where James works. So what that means practically for industry in particular, who want to deal with the universities, they'll come and expect to be able to strike certain agreements. And I'll have to say, well, that's against state law. We can't do that. And they'll say, but I just did this same deal with North Carolina. Different state, different laws. And there may be just nuanced differences, but they are sufficient to drive industry crazy from time to time, because it really is annoying to say, well, no, we just can't do that. And I used to, in the old days of the fax machine, when I was in North Carolina, have a page ready to send to the negotiator at the company side, when I would tell him, no, I absolutely cannot indemnify you, and I cannot agree to Illinois law. And he'd say, well, why can't you? And I'd just have my little letter that we had from the Attorney General and put it on the fax, and that's it. And that would have been a different letter had you been in a different state. To complicate matters further, James and I operate in a state which doesn't even have a legal code where other attorneys from any other state can practice. We have the Napoleonic Code in Louisiana, and you know, it's even more bizarre. So that's part of the difference, I think. And then you have the private school, public school differentiation as well, which is yet another series of stark. Yeah. Can I agree to this one?
One of the interesting things that we talked about earlier was, you know, in our innovation partnerships where, say, the project is 100K, the company puts 20K down, and then you're discussing whether or not to license or give an option to the IP, and what's the value of that? Do you wait until the end of the project before you assign a value to it? Or most companies would like you to tell them what the cost is going to be up front. And I realize from the discussions that we had earlier that it's different.
It's almost impossible for us to agree to a situation where you are pre-valuing something that has not yet been invented or performed. And it's mainly because of tax code. It's still a problem that we beat around between universities and private sponsors. But the tax code basically says that if, in particular, your university has a building that was financed by a tax-exempt bond, then any activities conducted in there cannot be for profit, basically. You can't have unrelated business income from that building. And tax bond attorneys are very protective of their tax-exempt bond status. It allows them to do it some more and to build more buildings and so on.
But that's very particular to the public. On the private side,
it's not just the public. I mean, we have that situation. Most of our buildings are appropriated, so we don't have that. Private schools, in my experience, not so much Tulane, I guess, but some other schools, Duke, one of the large schools in the southeast, very successful private university, mortally terrified of entering into any agreement that would jeopardize their many tax-exempt buildings. So they just won't do it. So that kind of discussion, I was really surprised to hear about that. Pre-valuing before it's been made, yeah.
But Paul, you would have done that before. You would have pre-valued. You would have had industry.
If we have the option, obviously we would prefer to say, well, we make an arrangement later on. Now, companies absolutely hate uncertainty, so if it is needed to get the technology out and get a partner, we have no problem in make an arrangement up front. Yeah. Even though we know that probably we will be at the lower range then, if we would have waited, etc., etc. But I think there you have to balance it out. What is it worth to you to get a partner and get the technology out, or do you really want the last % or the last % additionally and have the technology stay on your shelf?
In my past, when I was at a public university, a way we got around kind of both issues and kind of danced in between was we would actually do a range. We wouldn't say it's going to be 3%. We'd say we can negotiate between 2 and 5%. And we'd know pretty well we were going to be down at like 2 or 2.5. And you may have a handshake on the side and tell the company, you know, we're going to be reasonable, we'll value it appropriately. We can give you this range that makes you more comfortable and know where we're not going to ask for 10% and be unreasonable. But it also allows you to get the deal done and still maintain compliance with any tax issues or bond issues that you have.
Yeah. So either putting in a numeric range, which, as James says, is you're going to be forced to the bottom end of that range, or to say it'll be consistent with comparable deals in the industry.
Yeah.
Which, everybody knows. Again, a handshake is worth as much as a handshake if the two people who made that negotiation and handshake are not there 5 years later when the deal has to be negotiated.
But let me go back to the measures of success for knowledge transfer and the economic impact that universities have. In the US, what's the focus there?
So again, I'm going to tell you that it varies university by university, even within a state. Your point about leadership being engaged and understanding what is important is so absolutely on target for what I've experienced. If you have a chancellor who understands what this is about and its impact, and it's how many times you shake the hand and do a deal with a company, not how many dollars come in. If it's a startup company formation, they like to see new companies formed. They like to see money coming in from other states to help offset shortages in your own state. So all of those things add up. It really is difficult to, in states where we've had economic downturns, large unemployment issues in some of the industrial states, and this notion that startup companies are going to replace entire industries. It's really not true. So we have to be very careful about what we promise to chancellors and elected officials. We can build the churn and begin to sort of stoke up those fires of entrepreneurial interest, bring other people in and liven up the industry. But if you just lost a 2,000-person manufacturing plant, you're going to need an awful lot of startups in most cases to make that deficit disappear. So all of those things are important, but the trick from my point of view for a tech transfer officer is to manage the expectations of all of those stakeholders, because there is, unfortunately, this trend towards looking at a simple return on investment in terms of dollars. And you mentioned you don't like having to report patents. And the things that are really easy to measure, and I think I sent you a quote from one of our colleagues, Ken Nisbet at Michigan, and he said, it turns out in tech transfer, the things that are easiest to measure aren't really the ones that tell you whether you're doing a good job.
Yeah.
Right? It's easy to measure patents filed. I was once offered a bonus scheme by a VP for research who said, you get a bonus for how many patents you file. No,
took it.
I'm not going to. I mean, it would have been a really treat for a bonus scheme. You know, there'd have been a provisional patent application filed every day of the week. I said, that doesn't mean anything. That just means you've either got a very big patent budget or you're just gaming the system. So what is the impact? And again, I think what we've begun to see is a realization from university leadership and local government officials that it's really important to include the university in your regional economic development activities. So my office, even in an all research life sciences area, but particularly at the innovation campus, works hand in hand with the Louisiana Economic Development Office, with the local Chamber of Commerce. When they're trying to recruit companies to the area, they come and see us. They want to know what we can do to work with them, which sort of fits into what, at the very local level, what James is doing on a global level for his university. So we are, I think, increasingly being viewed as one of the parts of the toolkit that the economic development professionals have in the States to attract or retain companies, to persuade them we can work with you. We're much more user-friendly than we used to be 10, 15 years ago. And that's been a real problem in the States. And I think a lot of universities have realized that it's more important to count how many contacts you have with a company in total rather than that one transactional interaction that you had as a license. Because if you also realize they're going to sponsor research, they're going to hire your graduates, they maybe will give philanthropic donations to, to name chairs and so on, then you have to look at the whole thing as a holistic engagement rather than a linear transaction that just happens once. You want to keep them coming back and touching you at all these different places around the university enterprise.
And that brings us nicely to corporate partnering, to James. So James, you're a band of one and your team is focused on corporate partnering. Corporate partnering could be all sorts of things, right? So what is it in your definition? What do you do?
So basically, the easy way to think of my job is part traveling salesman and part concierge. So my job is to be on the road a lot. I go to places where companies and venture capitalists are. It's a lot of online dating where I send requests and tell them about the things that I think make our science look pretty, and hope that they accept a meeting with me. And a lot of the times they don't, and I feel bad about myself. And then they accept one, and I feel really, really good, and I actually dance around my office. And so you take those meetings, and it's corporate partnerships is really sitting kind of in between tech transfer and knowledge transfer and development or advancement, or those folks who are out trying to get those tax writable donations from people or charitable donations. And in that role, those folks, what I've learned from them is they ask people what they want to accomplish with their money. Well, our role in corporate partnering is to ask folks basically, what are you missing that we might be able to do for you from an academic institution? And as opposed to figuring out what you think you should sell them, listening to what they need, and then putting the pieces in front of them that might make sense, making the connections for them so they don't have to figure out how to navigate our complicated university systems, because we are diverse. We have different departments to do everything. Once you've seen one university or institute, you've seen one. Every single one is set up different with a different structure. And if you have one person whose job it is then to become the concierge and guide them to everyone they need, and that's what my job is, and pull those people into a room and get out of the way, and then tell them, if you have a problem, call me and I'll make it less bad. It'll never be perfect, but it'll be less painful if you call me. We'll work our way through. And I'm fortunate that I report to the Dean of the School of Medicine, and when I make a call, I can try and persuade people. When he makes a call, they jump. So it works out really well.
Very good. And James, how do you select the companies that you would target? Because you can't just target everybody, right?
So I look at our areas of strength and try and find companies that I think complement those areas of strength for Tulane. And that can be on the nature of companies who are oncology or infectious disease, or areas that we're really strong. It can be looking at venture capitalists for areas where we're spitting out companies, because more and more we're finding venture capital, and this is different than even 2.5 years ago when I started this job to a year ago. Venture capitalists are realizing they can't look in the same places they've always looked, which are in the U.S., Boston, and the Bay Area for biotech investment. Mm-hmm. And it's also the way of looking at what are your strengths? Well, I'm in New Orleans, Louisiana, that people like to visit, and so venture capitalists are looking, if they have to go somewhere else, they'd rather go somewhere they'd like to visit. And I'm fortunate to live in one of those places, and so that's kind of the thing: is look at your strengths, figure out both geographically and from a scientific perspective where you are and how you might make yourself look the most attractive to your date.
Very good.
But you don't want to visit in August, you have to say that.
Well, that's true. Although
August is not a
if
hurricane
they come,
month,
you just
yeah.
pour them some whiskey in a cold air-conditioned room. Yeah.
Are there any questions at this stage? Any more questions? Yes, Richard. Microphones are on the run to you.
All directions at once. Who will win?
Yeah.
Thanks to everybody for the illuminating insights. Paul, I have a question for you. Congratulations, first of all, on being the most innovative university. I think 2 years running. It's a phenomenal achievement. 5,000 researchers. I think you mentioned 68 licenses annually and 5 to 6 spin-outs with equity.
Yeah.
And those are good numbers by any international comparisons. And yet, if we as a system in this country produced, and I say this tongue-in-cheek, only numbers like that, we would be vilified by the policymakers and the funders. They would say, not good enough. What the hell are these guys in the universities doing? The research is useless. It's going nowhere. So I think you've triggered for me a thought about, shouldn't we be looking at different ways of measuring the effectiveness of tech transfer? And the measures that are being used in this country, not solely, but mostly, are, I think, not an indication of real impact or depth. And for Dave, I have a question. In your days in Autumn, I think the Autumn data suggests that you do around 850 spin-outs from universities a year, of that order, 800, 900. If you simply normalise that back to the Irish context, we might, as an entire system, do 8 spin-outs a year. Probably of the 30 spin-outs that come from universities, there are 15 that might be considered high potential startups. So are we overperforming, or are we just gaming it?
Now, there's a question that you probably can't answer.
Buy me dinner tonight. So, I really struggle with what is the right number of spin-out companies to come from a certain dollar amount of research expenditures. I mean, there's a very famous or infamous story of a certain university in the mountain west of the US that was producing more startup companies than MIT, and ridiculous numbers. And then it turned out that most of these startup companies had one employee. It was the director of tech transfer, and all the companies' incorporation papers were in his desk. And I mean, they were fakes, basically. They were getting SBIR money, the small business money. So that, for a long time, became the metric. Your VP for research certainly read, hey, it was Utah, everybody knows that, is looking at Utah, and they actually have a great office, but for about a 5-year period, they were just starting a company around every invention disclosure almost. So the rest of us, to your point, were then branded with, you guys are really awful. I mean, why aren't you creating startup companies like that? Well, they're not really companies. So it's easy in some ways to paper up a company and say, yeah, this is now a startup. Jeff made a point about, do you license for a startup? No, you wait until it's something that's there, and certainly until a PI is passionate enough about it to say, I want to build this into something that you can work together with me. The other challenge we have in the US is I want to keep it inside. The moment it becomes a company, the faculty member is on the other side of the table from me. He or she can't negotiate with me in our conflict of interest rules. So it becomes much more difficult to ease or guide or help support with whatever discretionary funds you may have. A technology, let's call it the project, not the company. But once they incorporate and become a company, the sides are opposed. And now your investigator can't negotiate with you, and it just becomes very difficult. So I like keep it, don't make it a company until one of Jeff's sort of magic points there, we say, yep, this is now ready that somebody's going to put money into it. So the right number is really difficult to assign because you never know what decisions are being made along the way. I see universities that file more patent applications per year than they have invention disclosures, and you sort of scratch your head. But it happens. I mean, you've seen that.
Did you want to have a comment?
Yeah, I think what I keep on struggling with, and it's a little bit frustration because this is my 17th year that I'm in the office, and still nothing has changed in that respect. There still is, in my view, an overemphasis in a lot of cases from governments on spinning out companies. Yeah? Their economic impact is highly overrated. Yeah? One thinks about the Googles, etc., etc. I mean, I understand they are the darlings because it's very visible and employment, and you can cut a ribbon when a new building opens, etc., etc. But it's first spin-offs, then second place, probably patenting and licensing. Everybody knows a couple of big success stories, and then barely nobody talks about collaborating with industry. And there's a reason why I said earlier on that still after 45 years, collaborating with industry is still our bread and butter. I am absolutely convinced that the economic value that we can deliver as research institutions for the regions, for our countries, etc., is way higher in the number of collaborative research and contract research and consulting that we do than in that handful of spin-off companies. And yet, every single discussion, every single metric tends to overemphasize the spin-off. It's a tool, and a very useful tool, and in some cases the only tool to get the technology out. But let's put things into perspective.
So is a good measure for the tech transfer offices then the research dollars that a company is willing to invest in the research? Is that the right metric?
It's one of several, but I think it's a very powerful one, because if you persuade someone else that what you have is worth them writing them a check for, you're having a good discussion. I mean, that's really validated, because companies don't part with their money easily. Investors don't part with their money easily, nor should they. So you have to present to them something that, as James says, looks pretty and is going to add value to their company. You have to be easy to work with. So yeah, I think that's one of the most important metrics to value. If I were doing an evaluation of an office, are you able to reach out, engage with somebody, do a collaboration? If it's sponsored research, is there an option built into that somewhere along the, all of those things. So again, it's, I think, a trend that is really happening in the US now, and you've done this already, clearly, but to move away from the linear transactional notion of you sponsor research, you make an invention, you file a patent, throw it up in the air, see who shoots it, and do a license with them and walk away. Yeah. That still happens a little bit, but mainly I think what we're seeing is the emergence of a different profession within tech transfer that James is sort of the personification of at the moment. There are 2 or 3 others that are doing this, and it really is that whole idea of and I hate to use the buzzword, but it's a holistic engagement with a company. And then with the university as well.
Right, and that's where folks in roles like mine can be really beneficial to folks in the more traditional tech transfer roles, because as part of your conversation with industry, and if you have people even in your advancement or development or classic donation offices who deal with those folks, ask them to ask as part of their conversations, what kind of data do you need in spaces you're strong in to move forward? And so I'll get that a lot, and we've had companies, and one of the most recent is a pain therapeutic for animal health, and they said, we need a canine study with 9 dogs with these 3 things. And I went to my faculty members, said, go price this. He priced it. We got a price of between $15,000 and $32,000. What it went, I went to my dean and said, we can have this data. We have 4 companies who would be interested if we had data in this space. And he funded the study out of his discretionary income. And so that's where Paul and his folks, they would have the choice to do that themselves out of theirs. But if you're at a university that doesn't have that, you might go to your leadership and say, here's solid information from industry or a venture capitalist, and they are willing to look at this and move if we can present this data. And it may not go forward, but it's never going to unless we have it.
Yes, very good. Any other questions from the audience? Yes, over here.
Hi, Jackie Barnett, University of Bristol. But my background for many, many years was in the South African tech transfer system. I've got a question, and possibly Tom might also need to answer it, and that's about skills, so just changing the tack. Have you seen in your territories the types of skills needed to do what we do changing in the last period? Secondly, are you struggling to find those skills? Because I know in South Africa and in Southern Africa, this is a huge, huge issue, is finding the right sort of skills. But even in my current work, it's not that easy to find the skills that you need, even in a place like Bristol. And the last question, do you think it's at all linked to the salary structures of universities? Because that's one thing I'm starting to hear as well, is trying to attract the right sort of skills.
So James, you obviously have all the right sorts of skills.
Or I've convinced someone that I do.
You're in a private university, so you're outside of the range.
No, well, so also, the thing that I see as tech transfer has moved to a profession and less of whatever we used to call it, where, I fell into it. Nobody grew up playing with tech transfer G.I. Joe or tech transfer Barbie as a kid. Now they do, and you have people who want to go into it. And those folks have what I would consider generally more of the harder skills, the sciences, things like that. And what I see that is often missing in folks coming in, which I think is a harder thing to train, is that customer service relationship management aspect. And I'll tell you, I spent 8 years behind a customer service desk at Kmart, where I had to learn that the customer was always right. You took it with a smile, and you might go home and then rant about people afterwards, and now we shut our office doors and do that. But I see less and less people who are able to sit and take it or say, you're right, I'm wrong, even when you're not, just to end the argument and move forward. And that's something that I see is lacking.
Yeah,
David.
My quote on that topic in terms of skills is when I interview people for licensing positions is to the hard skills, so hard sciences, hard skills. Yeah, it's important that you can manage technologies. Way more important to me in your role here is going to be that you can manage technologists. Because if you can't deal with technologists on the inside and the outside of the university, it doesn't matter if you can manage their technology. They'll never come back to you again. So you have to be able to build relationships. As James said, just basically take some crap sometimes from people who you know are wrong and you're right, but you have to, just play that game. And that is a difficult... I've found people are really not comfortable doing that in many cases. It's a very special skill to be able to speak to someone who is a leading scientist or engineer and know that they're actually wrong about something, but not tell them that quite exactly, but persuade them there's a better way of doing this. So that's an awfully difficult skill to acquire or to
There's a huge set of skills, I think, in tech transfer. Obviously, if you think about your licensing executives, they actually license, they do the patenting as well as. So you have somebody that can understand the technology, you have somebody that can figure out the market and where it goes to.
Yeah.
You can actually negotiate the deal, work the legals.
The legal's not. The legal is done by the
external
legal department.
Yeah, but the commercial aspects oversight of the legal.
Yeah.
So basically, a kind of a CEO in a box.
Which is also the reason why a big part of the people that we have in that office are homebred, so to speak.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
So quite some of them started relatively young and then grew within the organization, coming from industry or labs. And depending on the segment, for example, we had a vacancy for about, I think, 2.5 years, 3 years almost, to get an additional person for the physics in that department. And finally, we had to get it from her from the UK because we could not find it. So even with all the branding and even with, we have a little bit more flexibility as to HR policy, given our autonomy. I can't give people a yellow convertible just for clarity, but we can stretch it a little bit more. But even against that background, it still is extremely difficult for some segments. And if the economy goes well, that's the time that we face most difficulties, because then people go to industry, people get attracting offers. Period 2008 through, let's say, 2009, 2010, full economic crisis, then the applicants were flowing in because everybody was looking for a safe haven at that point in time. So,
but not anymore.
Not anymore.
Am I getting the call to wrap it up? Okay. So listen, I know there's loads of questions out there. These guys obviously have seen it and done it and have interesting perspectives and different approaches. It's a conversation that we could keep going all day, but I want to thank you individually, Paul. I want to thank you very much for coming in, and for David and for James as well. Give them a round of applause. Thanks very much.